Hello and welcome to Weekly MTG. I'm your host, Blake Rasmussen, and this is my camera. I'm looking in the correct place now. Today, we are talking about yesterday's banned and restricted announcement. The headline was no changes. Andrew.
No changes.
Yeah, so Andrew Brown is, as usual, joining us to talk about it. And Andrew's going solo today. A lot of the team is actually on their way to Amsterdam.
Yep.
For MagicCon Amsterdam, which brings us to the news before we jump into the BNR announcement. Now, of course, BNR announcement would often be in the news, but we're going to spend the whole show talking about that. So just a couple other items, quick reminders that, yes, MagicCon Amsterdam is this weekend. If you're already in Amsterdam, I'm a little jealous. It's going to be a fantastic show. It is close to sold out. I think there's some this information may be old. There may be some single day Sunday badges left. But that information might also be old. So at any rate, MagicCon Amsterdam is taking place. And with that, there are a couple things to watch out for this weekend. Of course, the Pro Tour is taking place. It is a modern Pro Tour. And Modern Horizons 3 has obviously shaken things up. We'll talk a little bit about Modern in this, but not nearly as much as a couple other formats. And then also happening on Friday at 1 p.m. local time, and I'm not going to do that math in my head right now, what time it is where you are, but we are going to do the preview panel. I'm a little sad not to be involved in this one, but that's okay. The team there is going to do a bang-up job. It's going to be hosted by Gavin Verhey. They are going to provide first looks at Bloomborough and Duskmorn, and there may be a little something extra in there, a little something to pay attention to, but we'll see. You'll see. That video will be posted after that panel happens live on site. So definitely check that out after the fact. But for us today, we're going to spend some time talking about the banned and restricted announcement yesterday. A bunch of different formats. Yesterday, if you're watching this, you may have seen that, we'll go to this graphic in a second. You may have seen that I posted a question on Twitter just to get people's questions and reactions to the BNR. So we have a bunch of those. They're on this fancy clipboard here. So we're going to go through a bunch of those, talk about that, and then we'll be taking questions from chat a little bit later. So if you have questions for Andrew, hold them for just a bit because we got a bunch of pre-formatted questions from all of you on Twitter that we're going to go through first. And Andrew, so I think the biggest question, or maybe the second biggest question, depending on the math, was the timing of the yearly announcement. So we've been talking a long time, a year, about this yearly announcement for Standard, that this is where we're going to focus on Standard. And then we had no changes. And our primary reason, not only, was that rotation is happening and changing things up. And as some people pointed out, that's always going to be the case with this one. It will. Which is intentional.
It is, yes.
But it is a good question. Would we ever make changes in Standard if we're always going to have rotations standing right there? Would we consider changing the timing of this? So what are your thoughts there?
Definitely we would consider making changes in the future. A lot of this is just in the details. Rotation is always going to engender some sort of uncertainty with the format, and that's obviously intentional. Like, we want things to be kind of new and fresh, and we're never going to truly know what's going to be a standout card, what's going to fall by the wayside. But that being said, a ton of it is in the details. Like, for this particular format, the one that I'm talking about right now with the last 4 sets rotating out, starting with Midnight Hunt, we're not seeing any cards being particularly dominant across multiple decks. So I'll give you a recent example. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is a card I think we would actually take action against if it was in the format today, because it's in so many different decks and it spans so many different archetypes that it's kind of an ever-present card that people will continue to see it over and over and over again. We're just not seeing that in this kind of format. All of the decks are pretty distinct. There's no one non-land card that's kind of like across multiple different archetypes. So I think with this one, it's more clear for us that no change was the answer. But I don't want to preclude us from ever doing anything like that. Sorry, I don't want to preclude us from making changes. So it's just for this particular format, no changes made sense. And in the future, we will always be diligent on which cards could be, too much to play against, too many different decks in the metagame.
Right.
We'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah. I will note, I saw in chat, it looks like our stream title is not correct. This is not an Assassin's Creed stream. As much as I would love to talk about that set, we're talking about the BNR today.
True.
Apologies for that confusion. So I want to dive a little bit deeper in Standard, because if the devil is in the details in this case, we should talk about the details. First of all, before we get into kind of cards that are rotating, were there any cards that were brought up for discussion?
Yeah, I think the biggest two I mentioned in my article were Atraxa and Knight Errant of Eos. So with Atraxa, for a long period of time while it was in the format, it was a pretty dominant force in the domain decks. And, at certain points in time, their win rate was super high. Sometimes it was a little low, but it generally maintained in that kind of top 3 deck position in the format for a very long time. The pros and cons to that, obviously, it is a cool card, but you might be playing against it too much. But after we saw, if we took stock of what exactly was rotating, when you lose all 5 of those tri-lands.
We can take a look at those. We'll start going through. So we're going to talk a bit about what cards are lost, but yeah, this is a big one for the Atraxa decks.
Right, exactly. So when that deck loses these cards, you lose so much of that domain potential early on, and we really think that's going to weaken it in the long term. While I'm not saying the card is, not going to show up anymore, if it does show up again, it'll probably be in a whole new identity of the deck, not in a domain style deck, which in our eyes would actually be a positive.
Yeah. Yep. So it's kind of that whole deck has to be redone.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
If it even exists in the same way.
Correct.
Let's keep looking at mana, and let's talk about the impact of these land cards from Neo Kamigawa.
Yeah, these cards definitely just show up in a ton of different decks, and they give a lot of utility out of your mana base. And I think the biggest loss from these cards is just that not all decks are going to have access to them anymore. It's very low cost to play these in your deck, and you generally had to think about if your opponent had one or not. But with them gone, not so much anymore.
Yep.
We'll miss them.
We will. They're also a knock to the Legends deck that had gained some popularity.
Right. Because of that cost 1 less.
Yep, because of the cost 1 less. Because of another card we'll talk about later that's rotating as well, Slogurk.
Right.
So, yep. All right, next up, a different cycle of lands that...
Speaking of Slogurk.
Yeah. So these kind of kill a whole deck by rotating.
Right,
out.
yeah. The Teamer Analyst deck, the crux of the entire deck was to kind of get these into play and keep recycling them until you had a ton of lands in play, and then you would eventually fireball out your opponent. With these gone, that is much, much more difficult.
Yeah. I am going to pause right now. So we are going to get to Legacy. It's on our list.
Yep.
I know that is what's at the top of chats. We are going to talk about Legacy. We're going to talk about Pioneer. And we're even going to talk a little bit about Modern as well. And then, of course, we'll take any questions if other formats come up. But we wanted to talk, this is rotation, so we wanted to spend a little bit of time on what's coming and going. So let's take a look at some non-land cards that are leaving the format and their effect. So we have quite the ubiquitous trio here.
Yeah, the core of the Esper mid-range deck is leaving here with Denic, Rafine, and Thalia. For a long time, this was a dominant pillar of the metagame, and with it gone, I'm pretty certain we won't see... Well, obviously they're rotated out, but Esper will have to show up in a new form to show up in Standard.
Yeah, and Rafine was really kind of the driver behind it being Esper, so it might not even be those colors anymore.
Who knows?
Yeah. All right, next up, let's see what we got here. I shed no tears for Kumano rotating out, but I know you're a fan of this sort of core of the red deck.
Yeah, so we're losing a lot of these key pieces in the red deck. which will maybe be replaced in some of the future sets.
There's always a red deck. There'll be some red one drop.
It's almost like we like this deck existing, Blake.
Yeah, some people do.
Okay.
Yeah. But at any rate, the mono red deck, which was not a huge player, it was around, but it wasn't a huge player.
It's definitely more of a player on Arena because of best of one.
Yep.
Less so in best of three and like bigger standard tournaments.
Yep, makes sense. All right, next up. So why'd we spotlight this one in particular?
Right. So the other card I mentioned that we considered banning was Knight Errant of Eos. Voldaren Epicure rotating really takes out some of its more stronger draws. So you can play this on turn 1, and then you can Gleeful Demolition the Blood, and then you can play Knight Errant on turn 2. Extremely powerful play. You can still do that with Novice Inspector, but with Voldaren Epicure rotating, the frequency of that is much, much lower.
Yeah.
And we think, it still has those draws, but it's just not as consistent, which I think is kind of like the happy middle ground we'll be hopefully happy with.
Yeah. Are you all keeping your eye on this white-red deck? Because I think it's the one you talked about that loses the least to rotation in terms of total number of
it is the deck that loses the least in terms of total numbers, but we think losing Voldaren Epicure will hurt its consistency.
Yeah.
We like those token-style Convoke decks existing. We don't like them doing that same play on turn 2 every time.
Fair enough. Next up. All right, we got a collection of white cards that make tokens here.
Right, yeah, so we have some of the core of the mid-range white cards here, and then also with the Wandering Emperor leaving big hit to some of the control decks.
Yep. Yeah, I'll miss Wandering Emperor. It's one of those ways I beat all those red decks.
I see.
Yeah.
That gain 2 life comes up.
Super important. All right, next up. Cards, this slide might as well just be cards Blake is going to miss.
Yes, more control cards leaving. I think probably the largest hit is going to be Memory Deluge here. Lots of inevitability, lots of card advantage.
Yep.
But who knows, it could be replaced in the future. We really like our 4-mana instant draw spells.
Yeah, you do. Would it kill you to make them 3 anyway?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. Next up, let's take a look. So there was a cycle of these marches, but this is the only one we're really calling out here.
Yeah, I think this was the most unique one in terms of the effect it had on the format. This showed up in a lot of kind of blue aggressive decks / the toxic deck. And it was really cool with Ivy. I really loved that Poison Ivy deck. It was super, super sweet.
I enjoyed that one. It's not my normal style of play, but it was so different that it was a fun little...
March of Swirling Mists, you will be missed. Get it? I was waiting.
You've had that one locked and loaded for a while.
I had that one in the chamber loaded.
All right, let's move on. All right, couple of these cards see play in Pioneer, so these are some pretty powerful cards rotating out.
Yeah, more of the kind of core of the mid-range black cards leaving. Not too many tiers for us with Day-Night leaving, not our favorite mechanic, but I do like Tenacious Underdog. He will be missed.
Yeah. All right, then let's take a look at a couple other cards headed out. So now we're gonna just take a quick look at some cards that were played from time to time. Saw a little bit of play from each of the 4 sets rotating out. What do you think of this crop here?
Yeah, so here we have Midnight Hunt, and I think probably the biggest one here is going to be Slogurk leaving, which, Slogurk, as we talked about, was kind of one of the linchpins in that Teamer Analyst deck. So with that gone, that deck is probably not going to exist anymore.
Yep. A couple other hits here. I saw play every once in a while, either in control decks as a way to build up a ton of card advantage at the end of the game, or in some combo decks. Consider... it was the best 1-mana cantrip in the format. But
Sleight of Hand is the new winner.
It is. It's on instant.
It's the new champion.
I like a good sleight of hand, but why not both? All right, next up. A few highly played cards leaving here
Crimson
as well.
Vow, yeah. I think obviously the biggest loss here is going to be Blood Tithe Harvester.
Yep.
Really the core of a lot of different decks, offering card selection, strong early body. Just this really, really powerful card. And also Path of Peril leaving too is a pretty big hit.
Yeah.
That's one of the big key cards against the Knight Errant Eos deck. So That card will be missed.
I'll miss inspired idea. I enjoyed
The quest.
the Proft's
The memory card.
the enchantment.
The
Yeah,
enchantment,
Proft's eidetic memory into this was really fun for a hot minute. All right, next up, we've got Neo Kamigawa, and there's a lot of role players here that are heading out.
Yeah, definitely. Neo is one of the more powerful sets in the environment. You know, you saw with the lands and some of the cards here. I think my biggest miss will be Experimental Synthesizer. I think one of the coolest commons we've had in a while.
I really did enjoy Synthesizer with Oni Cult Anvil. Again, not my normal style of deck, but it was very fidgety. Which was fun. Kaito's, I think, you know, when you're talking about that Esper deck, Kaito was often sort of a mirror breaker or could come in and really hurt someone who couldn't attack planeswalkers. And then and Michiko's Reign of Truth. There were some almost enchantment decks that this was a key card. They were so close. So close. All right, and then our final set of cards that we're highlighting, SNC, a lot of that set had a lot of heat here.
Yeah. You know, with Esper being a strong deck and with Domain being a strong deck, obviously you're going to see a lot more like 3-color and big multicolor cards here.
Yep.
But yeah, you know, there were a lot of strong cards in this set. I think Void Ren will be one of the more missed cards, and you know, lots of bangers on this one. Ledger Shredder, Make Disappear, Topiary Stomper, cool ones.
Yep. Yeah, there are other ramp options, but Topiary Stomper was, you know, for a long time the de facto choice.
Right.
I think it's kind of been replaced lately by Cornucopia, but still something that's going away. Make Disappear. You know, there's some other replacements there. Ledger Shredder can never be replaced anywhere in our hearts or in our minds. Okay. Chat. We're getting to you now. So that's a look at what is happening with standard rotation.
Yep.
You know, as people can hopefully see, it's a lot rotating out, and it's basically affecting every deck that's in the meta in a big way. So now let's turn to chat's request. So this is Legacy.
Sure.
And I think, Andrew, the biggest question is about grief. We've seen some big numbers on reanimate strategies. You know, reanimate plus grief is well known in Legacy, and even timeless on Arena.
For sure.
So what did the team think about grief in Legacy or anything else in Legacy?
Right, yeah. So this was probably our most difficult decision here. So, you know, it's easy for me to say that we want to wait for people to experiment with Modern Horizons. You know, Modern Horizons is a powerful set. We understand that based on the previous data from other Modern Horizons sets in the past, they have seriously affected the Legacy metagame. And that was part of our reasoning with going with no change. But it was super close. Like, there's a lot of good arguments on the other side, right? Like, when you look at grief and then reanimating grief, it is clearly just not that fun of a play pattern to happen often, right? So that was definitely one of the other big factors on the other side for us, where we were waffling between yes, no, no, yes. And at the end of the day, you know, we ultimately thought that because there aren't any major tournaments coming out, and because we think there's a little bit of room for people to experiment with the MH3 cards, that we can kind of just more package deal some of our older format changes or non-rotating format changes in with the next announcement, which is in August, I believe.
I forget the exact date off the top of my head, which I should know, but yes, it'll be the announcement that comes with Duskmorn.
Yep.
Yeah. So, okay, so that also goes into a question that a number of people asked, was kind of how you look at Legacy. You mentioned that there aren't any major tournaments coming up. Legacy doesn't typically have major tournaments.
Yeah, eternal weekends are the thing we you know, kind of factor in the most in terms of sanctioned tournaments that are planned way in advance. Because I'll talk about it with Pioneer, but like one of the things we really try to focus on is just like ensuring that when sanctioned tournaments are coming up and players have to prepare for them, they have a more stable format and they know what they're going into.
Now, obviously, we're not going to lock you into a decision now, but in your mind, let's say Modern Horizons doesn't move the numbers on Grief's play pattern.
Right.
How closely would you consider it for the next announcement?
Pretty closely. Again, it was a pretty close and tough decision for us in the end. So, I don't know. Interpret that as you will.
Okay.
But again, I don't want to create like a lame duck format. Like that's
Right.
never really our goal. But like, you know, with the new release of a set in a series that we've definitely seen a lot of impact in older formats such as Legacy, it's just like, it could happen or whatever, right? And again, like bundling the changes together has some value for us. So that was a lot of our thinking there with that change.
Yeah.
Or with that no change.
With that no change. There you go. Yeah, it's interesting to me because there were, I don't play Legacy, I do play Timeless.
Yeah.
There were a lot of similar discussions about Grief Reanimate in that format beforehand.
Right.
Now, Legacy, they are different. Legacy has had Grief Reanimate for a while. Timeless just got it.
Right.
But I did think it was interesting that the biggest deck to come out of Modern Horizons 3, adding Grief to Timeless, was White-Red Energy, of all things.
Yeah.
Which, super fun deck. I love it. But not what you would have expected. So I think, is that sort of scenario what you're playing around in Legacy, that something else emerges here?
Yeah, definitely. Like, this is in a sense a challenge to the community, right? It's like, we've seen this be kind of dominant. Here is a new set of powerful cards that empirically could affect the format. Give it a shot, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's essentially what we're saying here.
Okay. All right. So we'll see at the next BNR announcement, which again will take place. Again, I forget the date, but it will be the same cadence, Monday prior to the debut of Duskmourn. Now, in that same space, let's stick with Legacy because that was again probably the most asked about format. There were also questions about well, actually, let's start with how you make Legacy decisions. So there was a question on Twitter that I'm just going to read directly. Patrick Sullivan, how do you weigh MitGo data versus paper and player sentiment with Legacy bans? My experience is that paper evolves much more slowly.
Yep.
And so I'm curious how you weigh two different information streams that can appear at odds with each other.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. Generally, our philosophy, I think I've said this before, but for formats like Vintage and Legacy, it is way more community sentiment driven and paper driven. Like, these are players who, have been around longer, invested more into the format. So we definitely want to prioritize them and how they view the format and how they want to see the format change, more than how we would see, how we would take into account data from MTGO.
Okay. And then in that sort of same vein, when you're talking about player sentiment, there have been a few people calling for a Legacy Players Council in much the same way that we have a Pauper Council,
right?
And there's a Commander Committee. Has that been discussed at all?
Not really. I don't think it's really an option for us. Legacy is a sanctioned format by Wizards of the Coast. We also have information on, playing it out for future events, and our play programs really takes a lot of that into account, like talking about Eternal Weekends, stuff like that. And also we have information about cards that we are releasing in the future, like Modern Horizon sets, which do have impact on those formats, that it really doesn't make a ton of sense in terms of when we look at it from like planning out the events and the individual cards.
Yeah. So it's more, it's not that we have a council that we would hand the decisions over, but you do take into account.
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Now let's, we can come back to, if there are more questions about Legacy, we can come back to them. I do see people tagging @Magic in chat, which is perfect. Good job. You all know what you're doing. So I'm going to come back to some of those chat questions in a moment. But I did want to touch on Modern briefly.
Yep.
Because one of the most talked about cards coming out of Modern Horizons 3 has been Nadu. which, for those who don't know, it's the Simic bird that anytime you target one of your creatures, you basically get the
Coiling Oracle.
Coiling Oracle
Twice
trigger
per turn.
twice per turn per creature. And we've seen some combo decks
Right.
emerge from
Shuko.
that.
Yep.
Shuko, and they end with Thassa's Oracle and all that sort of jazz.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that deck, and how closely are you all watching it?
So right now we're seeing a lot of results coming out from modern leagues and modern challenges. It's the Nadu deck isn't as dominant, or not even dominant, right? It's showing up some.
Yeah.
It's not putting up 4 or 5 copies in the top 8. A little bit more of a slower cadence than that. So that's good. But we're also, obviously, just Modern Horizons is going to have a huge impact on the modern format. So we're obviously waiting and seeing and obviously the Pro Tour is going to have a lot of great information for us to educate our future decisions.
All right. We're going to go to some questions from chat. So it helps me find your question if you tag @magic at the front of it. That'll help me pull in the questions that are meant here for Andrew. So I'm going to start going through these questions. We are going to keep them primarily to the BNR announcement or questions about formats and that sort of thing. So if you have questions about Arena or that other topics, we just probably won't touch on them. It's not because it's not a good question. It's just because we got our BNR expert here. Let's use our BNR expert. So we're going to go back to Legacy.
Sure.
A different card. The question was, I'll just read it. How many eyes have to be on Orcish Bowmaster before you ban it in Legacy? Like, cards are designed to get around it. Look at Nadu Winged Wisdom not drawing cards. So I know we've talked about Orcish Bowmasters in the past, but how do you all think of Bowmasters in the Legacy format?
Pretty much the same. I've said it before, but like Legacy is the format where we want players to play Brainstorm. Bowmasters is very good against Brainstorm. I think part of Bowmasters, the noise has gone down because of the grief sentiment recently. So it's hard for us to kind of like pick out exactly what's going on there. But I think you can infer from the words I just used how we still feel about it there.
Okay. All right. Next, let's go to. Oh, can we get a firm August ban and restricted date? It might have been in the article. I was on vacation, so I don't recall.
I believe it was August 20th. That would be my best guess.
That sounds right. Yep. You can work backwards.
You have a Twitter account after this,
I do.
right?
I'll just tweet what the date is after this. If you follow me on Twitter, I'll tweet what the date is of the next BNR announcement.
Problem solving.
Problem solving. Let's see. All right. We haven't talked about Pioneer. And there were some questions about one archetype and one card in particular in Pioneer that we did see. So let's start with Nykthos. I saw a few questions about Nykthos in Pioneer.
Yeah. So right now, we see a lot of mono green being played in Pioneer, which is the core card it's built around which is Nykthos. But one of the interesting parts we're actually seeing right now from a lot of our online data is that while the deck is really popular, it does have a losing matchup against a large part of the popular metagame, which kind of signals multiple things to us. People really enjoy playing with Nykthos, or they like playing with the mono green deck. I mean, it is cool. It is an explosive mana deck. I mean, those are generally very popular. It also shows us that win rate doesn't exactly matter sometimes for some of these formats.
Yeah.
Exactly. So obviously, Nykthos it's hard to interact with. It can produce a lot of mana. And those are generally big warning signs for us when we're thinking about Magic cards in terms of the BNR list. But based on the information that we're seeing right now, it's just not that much of an issue.
People enjoy it and are playing it despite it not doing necessarily as well against some of the top decks.
Correct.
Makes sense. Okay, let's stick with Pioneer. Thoughts on the Amalia combo deck in Pioneer?
Yeah, so I think in my article I talked about how, we love creature combo decks. Like 3-card creature combo decks are really, really sweet for a lot of formats. They're very interactable. They have an awesome dream, and it really plays into what's awesome about Magic, where you try to assemble this thing, your opponent can't stop it, we'll see what happens, right?
Yeah.
That being said, one of the major downsides of the Amalia combo deck is just in paper Magic, you have the ability to draw the game. And as we saw in one of the last Pro Tours, we saw some top 8 decks, top 8 matches actually end in draws, which are not great for us. So we're also seeing its kind of resurgence into the metagame too, right? There were a couple challenges and events where it put up some really big numbers. And I think, you know, you can infer that based on what I said about mono green, you know, the Amalia deck does have a pretty good matchup against that deck. So, you know, we're waiting to kind of see how the metagames evolves based on its bigger resurgence and how decks will adapt to that deck being stronger.
Okay. I'm going to circle back to standard because I think we tried to we attempted to talk about this, but I think this is a very pointed way to ask about the ban window. So it's a good question. Would the yearly ban window for standard better serve the needs of the format if it was set after Worlds, being 2 sets post-rotation with a major data point from Worlds and before RCQ season feels perfect?
Excellent question and excellent train of thought. That is the leading candidate if we were to make a change of the ban window to that exact date. There are lots of pros and cons with it. Obviously, you listed a lot of the pros behind it. Like, I think the ban window in between two of the 4 standard sets, awesome idea, right? That gives the format the most opportunity to kind of change and churn potentially. And it's a good window after Worlds where we can have a lot of definitive evidence and a good narrative behind this is what happened here, we're doing this now. I would say the big cons behind it are, I think it kind of goes against how we're revitalizing standard, or, you know, like we talked about for the last couple of years, where we want people to be able to, you know, kind of invest in standard more and have more grassroots standard tournaments where you can just kind of play one deck and go for a long time. And I think the rotation window that we're talking about, the ban window right before the rotation, just offers a lot less, you know, kind of bouncing off points for my deck's gone, I can't play my deck anymore. And we really want standard to be that place where people can be like, I'm going to get my deck, I'm going to play it a lot, I can go to F&M once a month, play my deck, have a good time. And that's kind of the big goal we're shooting for.
Yeah, and it is interesting because it is kind of trying to balance different audiences.
Right,
exactly. The type of player that really keeps up with the format, that likes to see it be dynamic and change, would love to have multiple points where the format changes.
Yes, clearly.
But that player that you mentioned who, you know, goes to F&M, plays once a month, you have rotation, you get your deck together after that, you play it twice in that scenario, and then it changes again, potentially.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what we're trying to avoid.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense, but, you know, as you said, the team's going to keep watching. And
right, and again, like, we're continuing to, this is not like definitive, right? Like, you know, we're always going to make changes based on how we see the play numbers, how we see community sentiment, how we see basically everything, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if people just start playing it less after this window, and we hear a lot of people saying, hey, we want this format to change more, we are going to change it, right? Like, we're going to listen to our players, and that's how we're going to keep the game going.
All right. Next question, shifting back to Pioneer. Can you talk a little bit more about the goal and philosophy surrounding Pioneer? What does a healthy metagame look like?
Right, so with Pioneer, we kind of like to think of it as our modern junior, right? Like, it's our first stepping stone into an eternal format. You know, like we were saying with some of the standard cards that were rotating out, they still have their home in Pioneer, and we like that. We like when cards rotate out of standard, maybe I can invest into Pioneer, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's an excellent story for us. And I think that's kind of the thing we want to keep there, right? Like, we want to kind of ensure that the formats have their own kind of like cascading play patterns or whatever, right? It's like standard, I play a creature, I attack, maybe I play a removal spell. That's essentially the core of the standard gameplay, right?
Yeah.
Then we move to Pioneer, where it's like a little bit more complicated stuff going on. I can actually combo off. I can actually play a pure control deck, or I can play all cantrips or whatever, right? It's the first kind of format where you can kind of like, you have enough cards to go really deep into a certain thing. Then we hop into Modern, which is just that, maybe a little bit more muscles on it.
Yeah.
You know, you can really do some pretty crazy stuff there. And then eventually you get into the Legacies and Vintage, where it's like, you know, Wasteland you turn 1, Daze, Wasteland again, right? You know, it's a sliding scale. And, you know, Pioneer will always be kind of that first step after Standard for us in terms of what the format looks like.
Yeah.
And, you know, we still want, obviously, every macro archetype to be present. We're going to try our best to ensure that, but that's where we see where we want the play patterns and where we want to see the archetypes.
All right. I'm going to throw this question to you, but if you want to throw it right back to me, feel free to.
Sure.
If you're not going to make adjustments to formats in the middle of RCQ seasons,
Yep.
why are you scheduling ban announcements in the middle of RCQ seasons?
What a great question for you, Blake.
That's what I thought. So the reason that's me is it is a joint decision, but I've driven a lot of the conversation about when to schedule these. And it goes back to some of what you were talking about with having the single window for Standard. It's sort of similar for BNR announcements. Every set creates churn in formats. And so we try to pair the BNR announcements with the sets to minimize like having churn every other week or something like that. And so the reason we do it before the set is that so people can evaluate the set with full context of what's happening in whatever format they care about. So that's why the timing is what it is. It is set release focused because we think it lets people evaluate the sets best. However, it is an interesting thought to tie it more closely to play seasons. It's not something we've delved deep into.
Yeah, that would definitely require a lot more joint effort with the play team,
Yeah.
communications, all of us together. It's an interesting idea, and it's something that we could execute on. But I would also say, like, in terms of, there's your side of the question. I think my side of the question is also interesting too. It's where it's like, yes, they are scheduled over RCQ seasons, but it's better for us to have them there than to not have them at all. Like, let's say a new card in the set gets released and it has a Felidar style effect on the format. We would want to take action against that just to make sure that when you're playing those RCQ seasons, that you're like, okay, if something ridiculous happens, they'll fix it.
Yep. All right. Let's see. Are you guys willing to, and we get variations of this question a lot, but it's a good question after MH3. Are you guys willing to unban cards in Modern, especially right now that MH3 has changed so that cards like Ponder and others can come back into the format?
Yes, 100%.
Cool.
That is definitely more in the future, less of a thing we want to couple with the release of a set.
Makes sense. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but we didn't phrase it quite like this, so I'll ask this question. When you did the Karn ban and the Copter unban, you mentioned the plan was to take a bit of a more active approach. This is about Pioneer.
Right.
Has that stance changed?
No, it hasn't. I think it's just been a little bit more difficult with the RCQ seasons like I was talking about. But yes, it is, that philosophy is still around with Pioneer. We still want to, ensure that the people playing it, get what they want.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, from my point of view, it sounds like they wanted more change. But again, I think it's important to uphold the sanctity of like, these are scheduled tournaments. I'm preparing for this tournament, and I'm getting these cards.
Yep. All right. This is a good kind of behind the scenes question. Do you have BNR decision makers actively participating in Legacy, trying to understand if you have actual boots on the ground in the format? Do you want to talk a little bit about format experts?
Yes. Yeah, we do have people who play the format on Play Design, the team that focuses on balance and competitive cards for that we release in our sets. We have like designated experts who play the format. And I won't shy away from it. The person who plays the most Legacy was like, I think we should ban Grief. And again, like I was talking about, it was a really tough decision. A lot of pros and cons on each side. But To answer your question, yes, we do have a lot of experts there.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. Are you guys? I'll answer this one. Are you guys willing to do a public poll on banning grief now? So just generally, the question of this is about grief, but public polls. We will probably never do a public poll on a BNR decision. Never say never, but there is so much data and future information that we have access to in the building that public polls cause a number of problems. Also, I can't imagine the outcry if we did a public poll and then did the opposite. So the team's really thoughtful and definitely takes public feedback into consideration, but a poll is just a lightning rod for all kinds of issues. In communications, I generally don't like polls. I just don't. That's just me. But okay, let's see. Is there any chance? I'll repeat it. So again, on Legacy, just generally for those coming later to the show, we've talked a bit about grief. The next BNR window where there would be action taken is the one with Duskmorn, and the team is closely considering it. This is a good overall question. Is there an overall BNR philosophy? Or how do you approach these decisions format to format dependent? So is there like an overall big picture BNR philosophy? Are there specific format BNR philosophies? How do you balance all that?
Yeah, I think I talked a little bit about this, but every format's different. I think when I talked about how we see the play patterns for each format, I think that also informs how we approach the BNR list for each of them. And also, with older formats like Legacy, we very much take into account the community sentiment as well. And then for, formats like Standard, we have much more information about the sets that we're releasing, right? When we release a new set into Standard, it's going to have a much larger impact on that format than, let's say, it will on Legacy, right? Like for Standard, you might see it might be 20% of, of Standard's makeup is part of the new set. For Legacy, if one card shows up, I'm like, that was interesting. Yeah. Whatever, right? So it's always a sliding scale. And yes, we do have different philosophies for each format. I could go way deep into that, but I don't really know what I should do here.
Fair enough. All right, this one is not a BNR announcement, but I'm going to answer it anyway. Because I've seen this question a few times lately. Will there be an announcement day this summer? So our sort of big yearly announcement where we talk about the future of Magic, that's going to be at MagicCon Las Vegas. So if you're already attending that, or I don't even know if there are tickets left for that one. There might be, or badges left. That's where we're going to do it. Of course, even if you're not at the event, we will post the video afterwards. But we're focusing a lot on MagicCon Las Vegas. Last year we did it at Gen Con. This year we're moving it into MagicCon Las Vegas for a variety of reasons, and we've got a ton of stuff to talk about. Yep. It's going to be a big one. It's going to be a big one. So yeah, MagicCon Las Vegas. Here is something we haven't talked about much. Any considerations for brawl bans? And maybe you want to talk a little bit about also how you tackle arena-focused formats versus tabletop-focused formats.
Yeah, so Arena, the representatives for Arena are always at our BNR meetings, and if a change needs to happen in their format, they'll consult us, and likewise with Paper, we like to consult them. So generally with Arena formats, they curate it, and that's basically it.
Yeah, and those formats are also, you talked a little bit about the data discrepancies by format.
Right.
Those Arena, Brawl isn't Arena only, but that's where 99%
most
of Brawl
the play happens. Yep.
They have essentially perfect information.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's, again, one of those just information differences for the formats. Okay, here's a vintage question.
Ooh.
You mentioned in the last BNR that you had your eyes on Urza's Saga in vintage. Saga is still the same amount of the metagame as before, but the BNR says things look healthy. Why the change of heart?
Mostly because we listen to sentiment a lot, and while we're listening to sentiment in terms of like the important vintage players, like they'll generally be pretty vocal on social media, but we also look at the data too, and the internal data is looking a little bit better than it did last time. So I think that's why you're seeing some of that. And also, while Modern Horizons impacts Legacy and Modern more than Vintage, it still might impact it a little bit. So we're also taking a bit of a wait and see approach there as well.
Yep, makes sense. Let's see. So I do see a number of arena-focused questions, like, is there any chance of ranked for Brawl? We wouldn't have those answers. So good questions. We're just not able to answer them here. Let's see. Okay, so I don't know that you will have the answer to this because it's probably more of an arena question, but maybe you do. Who knows? Plus, if I can't talk about Canadian Highlander, I'd love to talk about Timeless.
Great.
With the amount of cards that have gotten on Arena for Timeless, you have enough data for the format pre-MH3. When are those cards getting restricted?
I don't have that information.
Okay.
Sorry.
As someone who does play Timeless, I don't think anything needs to be restricted. There was actually, so there's a Timeless subreddit, and there was a discussion about this the other day. It was focused on grief, and it was commenting on how grief wasn't a problem, how Timeless kind of absorbed it. And one of the lines in your article stood out about how there's broken things in Timeless, but somehow it all works because everything's broken and it's amazing. And somehow this white-red mid-range deck is like the best thing you can be doing right now, which is really cool. But yeah, I did think that was, it's wild that there were people in that thread who are like, yeah, Demonic Tutor doesn't need to be banned or doesn't need to be restricted. The format could deal with that.
Strong card.
It's a wild format. It's great. But yeah, so that is the Arena team does a lot of the data management on Timeless. So we don't have that data, but I don't know. Timeless is cool. Dark Ritual was the other. I do see that chat. Dark Ritual was the other one that was discussed. There's probably more of a case to restrict that one than Demonic Tutor. I think you could even swap the two, but who knows? Let's see. That's an Arena question. That's a Mitgo question. Here's a good question because we have long had all of the data for Mitgo, but the public did not. Daybreak has recently changed their stance on that. They're going to be releasing far more data. Do you think that is going to change the way you all look at the Mitgo focused formats like Legacy?
Yeah, I think it'll change it a little bit. Generally, I think the biggest difference is going to be how we've seen, Standard evolve over the years with the era of information. Previously we've seen, paper formats that are more difficult to get into kind of evolve more slowly because there are less people kind of iterating on it and there's less information around. But, with more information comes more rapid kind of like ideology around what is strongest and what is weak. So I think the thing we'll see probably the most is how the format changes itself, not our management around it.
Yeah. Makes sense. All right. That, I think, is about all of the questions that we're able to answer. I do see more good questions in chat that are focused on things like Universes Beyond or Arena or things like that. If your question is about the future of Magic, you've got a couple upcoming things you want to mark on your calendar. One is, of course, this Friday at 1 p.m. Amsterdam time. That is going to be our preview panel where we're going to talk about Duskmorn and Bloomburrow and something else, a thing. And then also MagicCon Las Vegas. I'm not going to be in Amsterdam. I will be at Las Vegas. And at Las Vegas, we're going to talk, again, very future-facing, very big picture kind of stuff. much like we did at Gen Con last year. So you'll definitely want to check that out. Both of those will end up on YouTube after the fact. Otherwise, check out Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3 coverage. Again, starting this Friday, Amsterdam time. Definitely head to magic.gg to get a full rundown of everything you need to know about the Pro Tour. That's going to tell you, again, start times, where and when you can watch the stream, and a little bit of preview of what you can expect for Modern Horizons Pro Tour. Otherwise, we are going to be off next week because Wizards is closed. Wizards of the Coast has taken a week off for start of July. It's our summer break. But we will be back the week after that with the debut of Bloomborough, which is a highly anticipated set. I'm really excited about it. We're all really excited about it. Bloomborough is adorable. So Weekly MTG will have the after show right after the debut on that Tuesday. Until then, we'll see you in 2 weeks.